We have Alexander Mercuris in London, the Oracle of London, and we are joined once again with the one and only, the great man himself, Mr. Robert Barnes. Robert, how are you doing?
Well, at the off-the-record bar at the cellar of the Hotel Palmer outside of D.C., when they heard about the recent new checks being issued to Ukraine, you could hear chants of Slava Slushfunds as the money continues to churn and churn and churn, while other activities were going on in some other locations.
Oh, yes, they were. Yes, they were. Where can people find you, Robert, real quick?
Yeah, they can get all of the content, including exclusive content, hush hush videos. I have one up on alternative theories of history and conspiracies on MK Ultra currently. Got one coming up on Bill Barr coming up this weekend about his interesting family history. As well as some other ties and connections at vivabarneslaw.locals.com.
Link is in the description box down below. At the end of the live stream, I will make that into a pinned comment as well. The best channel on locals. Definitely plug into their locals channel. It is fantastic, and you get a full ton of content. So let's get right into it, everybody, because we have got so much to talk about. And we've got a lot of detective work to get into. But first, let's say hello to everybody that is watching us on Odyssey, on Rumble, on YouTube, and on the Duran.locals.com. Hello to the chat on the Duran.locals.com. Hello to everyone that is watching us on Telegram as well. And a quick hello to our amazing, awesome moderators. Allison Blunderland is with us. Reckless Abandon is with us. Valies, it is good to have you with us. And I think I saw Zariel hiding somewhere in the chat. Zariel, how are you doing? And I think I've got everybody. Facts Matter. Facts Matter is also moderating. Good to have you here. And let's jump into it. Alexander, Robert, I'm going to pass it off to you. Before I forget, though, Alexander and Robert, Reckless Abandon wanted me to ask you guys, when you start discussing everything, if you can touch upon the hit lists in the United States, the Ukraine hit lists in the United States, and what are the legal implications of those lists? Like, what's going on there? I just don't want to forget that. So I throw it over to you, Alexander, and to the great Robert Barnes. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
That's a very good question, actually. But before we get to that, I just can't help but make the point that, we're going to talk about lots of things, but one of the things that pulls everything together is follow the money, it seems to me. And just to say, Robert, you started about the latest checks for Ukraine, and we saw $1 billion, provision of weapons for Ukraine announced yesterday. And I said to myself, this is really impressive. They're going to provide Ukraine with another $1 billion of weapons. 18 HIMARS systems. Except it turns out they're not. Because they're not actually going to provide Ukraine with 18 HIMARS systems. They're going to order the Raytheon or whoever makes these things to actually make these systems. And they might be provided to Ukraine in 1 or 2 years' time. Now, I wonder whether there's going to be a Ukraine in 1 or 2 years' time. But I mean, follow the money. The money is flowing. The money's flowing into the MIC. The money is going to flow into parts of the gas and energy industry as well. I'm sure some of that money is finding its way into Washington, to all sorts of interesting places, and other places too. And well, maybe it's not so completely unrelated to the fact that there are lists of people who are, raising issues. What do you think of the list, Robert, before we get onto the money? I mean, what would be the implications of a list like that in the United States? In Britain, it was published here. It would be a very serious matter. At least the police would certainly take action, and they would be talking to whoever published that list, and there'd be criminal charges of that. I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever. But it's Ukraine. Nothing happens. Nobody says anything. Nobody talks about anything. What do you think?
I mean, it's deeply problematic. I mean, Senator Rand Paul is on that list. For those that don't know, it's, some called it a blacklist, others have called it a hit list, put out as supposedly people that are pro-Russian. But if you look at what the language and lingo utilized, and of course, Dugin's daughter was on that list, and she was assassinated by what appears to be a Ukrainian covert operative, is that this is more of a hit list. These are basically people being called Russian spies.
Yeah.
Engaged in sabotage effectively, seditious behavior, the kind that was used during World War I to lock up people like Eugene Debs, socialist presidential candidate for the White House after he had one of his most successful campaigns in 1912. And so you look at that, it's problematic. I mean, it depends on how the list would be interpreted. I mean, it has been distributed here, published in a certain sense. America's First Amendment laws are limited to imminent incitement of violence. So, in other words, it can't just be incitement of violence. It has to have imminent risk of the violence actually occurring, what's sometimes called true threats. Now, all that law is being eviscerated in the context of Alex Jones, who's going through another show trial in Connecticut after the show trial in Texas. But putting the Alex Jones exception to every rule that exists on the planet, to give examples, famous case Brandenburg v. Ohio, Klan rally where they called for violence against the local black population. Supreme Court said no legal action could be taken against them because it wasn't imminent risk of a true threat. Famously, at a Vietnam protest in the 1960s, there's special federal laws protecting the president of the United States from assassination threats. A guy got up and talked about his gun and who he was putting in his sights, whereas Lyndon Baines Johnson. U.S. Supreme Court said that, too, was not a true threat because it didn't have an imminent risk of the event occurring. And so that list would be legal in the United States at this point because they would likely conclude it's not an imminent risk of violence, even though it's deeply problematic that such lists are being distributed. And it's kind of interesting how those lists tend not to reflect necessarily Ukrainian adversaries as deep state adversaries. I mean, you have Glenn Greenwald on that list. You have, Rand Paul on that list. These are people that haven't been that big of a needle on the issue of Ukraine specifically. They've been critics of U.S. policy, but nothing real strong. They have, however, been two of the strongest deep state critics. And it makes you wonder who the original author of that list was. At least it's probably a little bit more subtle. They at least have some sort of patsy compared to the utter debacle and disaster of what they did in terms of probably the biggest terroristic act in the modern era, at least against civilian infrastructure, by a state as opposed to private actors. And it's very apparent the U.S. blew up the pipeline. I mean, within hours of it occurring, I had friends of mine who were used to be in a particular branch of the military that would actually execute that precise task, who explained to me that U.S. definitely did it, and he knew likely who was part of it because he helped train some of those people. And then he pointed me to sources, and then to others, stories and articles, said here's where you can find the trail. And of course, where it took place is where just a few months ago we were doing special practices of learning how to use things to test the underground. Purportedly it was to monitor for underground undersea mines using underwater drone technology. But it's extraordinary that in the same place that they detected this pipeline explosion is exactly where the U.S. military was around the time of the event. The same tactical units, Navy SEAL connected units that were present. And it was the same one just a few months before, supposedly running exercises to test how certain equipment would work with underground explosions, supposedly about mines, in exactly the same area. So, and then you had Biden, who's such a dementia candidate idiot. I mean, he was asked when he made that comment about, we'll stop Nord Stream no matter what if Russia invades Ukraine. Somebody followed up and said, how? This is a German-Russian deal. And, Biden can't help himself. He smirked in the reaction to it. I mean, it was like, there's something. And, of course, Victoria Nuland has been predicting this for a while. And I think for people wondering why did the ex-foreign minister of Poland thank the U.S. with his thing, given he's tied to neoliberal establishment people by marriage here in the United States and by family and other relationships, It's because there are large parts of the deep state apparatus here in the States that would like to take credit for this. They think what they did was great. They think what they did is prove the power of America to dictate its agenda around the globe. They want to take credit for it. They're like Jack Nicholson's character in A Few Good Men. He wants to say, "You're damn right. I ordered that. Well, I ordered that bread." So it's the same mindset. It's the reason why they yapped about the election fornication, right? I mean, I forget it was a time, or I think it was time. They couldn't help themselves. They had to say, "Yeah, we stole it, and we did it for you, the American people. We did it for democracy and all the rest," because they're proud of what they did. And it's a mindset, that bleeds over into our other topics of conversation today, because it's about complete lack of respect for boundaries, any boundaries. I mean, here you have the United States government involved in one of the major state, not just state-sponsored, state-directed, did it, terrorist activities on civilian infrastructure against primarily a principal ally. I mean, how much it hurts Russia is up in the air, given how much Russia really thought they were ever going to use either Nord Stream 1 or 2 in the future. It stripped them of leverage vis-a-vis Germany, but mostly it screwed Germany. I mean, it kept Germany from having a bailout package down the road of any for their own economy and their own industry, which the U.S. had been a long critic of. I mean, the Trump administration was critical of it. Rick Grenell was critical of it. Everybody on the U.S. side hated the deal that Schroeder cut with Putin all the way back, that Merkel continued to promote German industry with cheap Russian gas. As the Credit Suisse financial advisor said, it was one of the greatest deals of all time for Germany, in the sense of, and their industry depends upon it. I mean, how they're going to replace it. But if I were looking for conspiracy theories, I would look to see whether anybody was shorting certain German stocks and putting some money maybe in American LNG stocks, that a little bit before these events happen. They always got to cash in, the way the deep state kind of operates. But I have zero doubt the U.S. deliberately, intentionally blew up the pipelines as a way to strip Russia of any leverage and prevent Schultz from bailing out his own country and his own problems, self-created problems, by doing it. It is extraordinary to see the EU today blame Russia. I mean, it's like you know, first you were blowing up your own nuclear facilities, and then you were shelling yourself all the time and shelling your own children in the Donbass, and now you blew up your own pipeline and your strongest piece of leverage with Germany. I mean, the degree of insanity they're asking people to believe, it's like pandemic level propaganda. But I have no doubt the U.S. committed one of the most, and it's extraordinary how low coverage there is in the U.S. This is one of the most extraordinary terroristic events against civilian infrastructure, against primarily an ally, Germany, in the history of the world since World War II. I mean, I don't know of many state-sponsored, state-directed, state-enacted terroristic events like this, and we really didn't hide it that much. I mean, it's kind of a little bit terrifying, but it's reflective of the whole Biden administration. Boundaries are gone, limits are gone, restraints are gone. This is the most dangerous administration in American political history.
I completely agree.
Great analogy with A Few Good Men, by the way.
It is, yes, absolutely.
Absolutely. Go ahead. Sorry, I had to get that in there because I was.
Yeah, you did. You're absolutely right, Alex. Can I just say? I mean, you're absolutely right. This is the most dangerous administration I have ever known. Program about this yesterday, in which I expressed the identical view to the one that you just have, and somebody then forwarded to me a Guardian article from about 2004 or something, in which that article drew my attention to a book published by some American intelligence person about how the US engineered the explosion in a Russian pipeline way back in 1982. And this was done during the Reagan administration. And what they did was, it was a gas pipeline. It was sending gas to Europe. The Reagan administration wasn't happy about it. So the CIA arranged for some software to be incorporated in the pipeline. And then the software was sent to Siberia, Western Siberia. And then after a few months, it caused an explosion. Apparently, it was an enormous explosion. It could be seen in space. There is a fundamental difference. And that was an attack on the infrastructure, the energy infrastructure of your Cold War adversary. This is an attack, if it was done by the United States, on the energy infrastructure of your most important European ally. Now, I just cannot comprehend how a responsible government could do a thing like that. I mean, it is something which, if you'd asked me 10, 25 years ago, I would have said impossible. And here we are. And it looks like, I'm convinced, just as Robert is, I'm convinced it's happened. And when this sort of thing happens, it's really rather scary, because you know that you are dealing with someone, an administration that has no boundaries. And what have we been talking about in program after program with Robert since we started this series? It's about extraordinary abuses and contraventions of the Constitution and legal system of the United States, carried out by the administration, carried out by the agencies of the administration. And they do this time and time and time again. And it's getting worse and worse and worse, and it's becoming ever more dangerous. Now, Robert, you said that this is going to be a disaster for Germany. I was reading the Financial Times this morning, as I always do, and lo and behold, there was an article based on the work of some German think tanks, and they put it all together, and they say that because of the loss of cheap Russian gas, Germany could be looking at an 8% contraction next year. An 8% contraction in 2023.
In other words, bigger than Russia's contraction is likely going to end up being.
Well,
They've sanctioned themselves. You know, I was initially a skeptic of people saying that the U.S. wants to sink the German economy.
Yeah.
I was like, I don't know why would we want that? I get that maybe we could get in some competitive edge, but it's not like, mostly that would potentially go to China's competitive edge in terms of certain areas of industrial development, manufacturing, output, etc. But, this is really overt. In other words, they know that the consequences of this is not only removing a political tool, but would do severe damage to the Germany industry moving forward. And I don't know how much Germans recognize or how much they were, don't connect cheap gas to the economic competitive edge they've had in the last 2 decades within continental Europe. They've maintained their industrial production output, whereas large parts of elsewhere in the Western world did not. And I don't know how they sustain that without natural gas, without cheap Russian gas. The idea that American LNG is much more expensive, and that's going to take a lot more time to produce. It will line some pockets of some American companies, but it can't substitute from a cost-effective perspective in Germany. But what's extraordinary is some people say that criminals have low IQ, and I always like to point out, aside from I have issues with IQ testing, putting that aside, I was like, it's only caught criminals who have low IQ, because those are the only people you're testing. You're not testing the uncaught criminals. So, and what you find in common is they are only one-step thinkers. They're not two-step thinkers. So they think, oh man, I'd like to grab that purse. They don't think, how do I get away with it? Second step's not there. And that's how they get caught. That's why caught criminals have low IQ. But the Biden administration is a similar low IQ caught criminal kind of administration. It's like they have one step ahead. We'll take out the ability for Russia to have any leverage over Germany, or for Germany to wuss out at the end in terms of supporting the Ukrainian conflict and war by permanently ending. I have no doubt that these plans have been decades in the making. That they had made the plans to take out how they would take out the pipelines way back. The hostility had been there from the inception. Amanda Milius, my friend, daughter of John Milius, the great movie director, she herself documentary director of The Plot Against the President, making a new documentary on John McAfee, doing a bunch of other great documentary projects. She worked in the State Department under Trump. and talked about all the insanity there. The State Department was dominated by a combination, more neoliberals than neocons, depending on your perspective. That's really only a slight variation. It's like the difference of opinion about Iran, say, or Saudi Arabia. But same imperialist, globalist mindset, empire builders. But not only their self-righteousness was off the charts, but they were more obsessed. The number one issue she said they were obsessed with was Nord Stream 2. It's like, of all the things in the world to be obsessed with, they were obsessed with Nord Stream 2. That's why they're always putting pressure on Grinnell to stir things up. Now, he stirred him up in such an undiplomatic way that he actually undermined American interest in Germany, because that's Grinnell. People like Grinnell because he did some good work at the Office of Director of National Intelligence about Russiagate, Spygate. Grinnell was the guy who worked with Pence to make sure Julian Assange got seized and stolen and put in prison. I have no sympathy with him. Only reason he didn't get to join the Romney campaign team is because Romney refused to have any gay people on his team, of publicly gay people. I mean, that's Romney being Romney. Pick some women instead. That's classic. But he was never, he did limited good work, and it's emphasized the word limited. His alliance with Trump was one of convenience, not of shared ideological approach. But they were just obsessed with this parochially. And I always thought, like, what are they, because they were talking D.C. about this possibility all the way back then. Well, we could always just take them out. We could just take out the pipelines. They're just not, they're not invulnerable from sabotage. And we're probably better at this than almost anybody. I mean, we tried to do it with the Soviet cables back in the day, all this. I mean, our big advantage over China is in the submarine area. It's one area where our military is still technically quite competent, even if wokeism is corroding the military otherwise, despite some liberal media people saying the Ukrainian army is proof that wokeism is the future of the military success. But I couldn't understand. It's like, what do you think? Obviously, they knew that probably Der Spiegel's accidental leak almost of the CIA tipping off the Germans is that they already ran this by the Germans and they didn't get major pushback, apparently. Because they're not tipping them off. The Russians are going to do it because the Germans would know that's not going to happen. I mean, there's other ways for the Russians to do this than cut off their own leverage. That's not going to happen. And as the Russians pointed out today, the area where the explosion took place was under control of U.S. Military and intelligence at the time it occurred. But they were expecting no blowback at all from Germany. No blowback from anybody in Europe. I mean, the rest of the world's going to know what this is. And Europe's going to know really who's responsible, despite what they're preaching or teaching. And it's like, what kind of mindset is we're going to engage in massive civilian terroristic infrastructure that mostly impairs an ally, and nobody's going to get upset about it. Instead, they'll actually use it to blame Russia more and put more sanctions on them. I mean, it just shows, I guess, the degree of corrosive corruption in European governing regimes. But but otherwise, also maybe they just don't have a second step. It's like Nancy Pelosi going to Taiwan. It's like, well, what's step 2 if China reacts a particular way? What's step 2 if Germany or Europe or the global South reacts a certain way to this terrorist attack on Russia? Instead, we get the Telegraph today talking about maybe tactical nuclear warfare might be okay. Here's how it could work out all right. These people are insane. There's no other way to put it, and they're low IQ. Yeah, if you want your criminals to at least be Lex Luthor. They're insane. At least be intelligent. Now we got nuts running. We got dumb nuts running the show.
Absolutely. What's particularly frightening is we have, as you said, idiots running the show. But they're idiots who do have the power to command still what remains, in many ways, in most ways, the most technologically advanced military in the world. I completely agree. If you want to get someone to do something under the ocean better than anyone else, it's the US. The US has the best people at this. Ask anybody who knows about these things, and I've asked around, they all say the same. The Americans have the best submarine fleet, the biggest submarine fleet. They got they're the people who have the midget submarines, who understand this thing backwards. And well, there you go. Just a few other things on this Robert, you said the rest of the world knows. I was reading another newspaper I sometimes read, as well as the Financial Times, is Global Times, which is, as we know, the English language mouthpiece of the Communist Party of China. Anyway, they did an editorial about this, and it was a very fascinating editorial, because it doesn't actually say it's the US that did this, but they set up the whole thing basically to say, look, we know it was the US that did this. I mean, you only have to read it. The clues all point that they set out all point very obviously in one direction. And everybody around the world is going to think that. They're all going to think that it was the US that did this. Now, a number of other things. Firstly, why would the United States get so worked up about a couple of gas pipelines? I don't understand that, actually. I mean, anybody who knows Germany well, which I do, I've never really know it reasonably well, would tell you that this is one of the most loyal states in the Western Alliance. I mean, German political leaders simply cannot imagine any kind of political alignment for Germany which is not led by the United States. There's a few people on the margins, the AfD, a few people on the AfD, a few people, on Die Linke, which is in the process of slow motion collapse, by the way, who, sometimes quibble about these things. But if you know German politicians, I mean, they are Atlanticists to the core. It just is inconceivable to them that they could be anything else. There's German industry, which obviously wants to trade and sell and do business with Russia and China and everywhere you like. But if you're talking about an alliance, a loyalty to an alliance, worrying about Nord Stream 2 somehow undermining that alliance, if you know your Germany, that is ridiculous. That is absurd. That is completely ludicrous. And yet, it seems people in Washington were fixated with this. And you're absolutely right what you said about the importance of natural gas in giving Germany an economic edge. Gerhard Schroeder, who was a very clever man, he did two things for Germany. The first is he carried out very, very controversial labor reforms, which basically weakened the position of German unions and made German wage systems much more competitive. That was, by the way, one of the effects of that is that it undermined forever working class support for the Social Democratic Party of Germany. And that's why they've never really managed to hit the 40% votes that they did in the past when they were led by people like Willy Brandt and Helmut Schmidt. But anyway, that did make those reforms Schroeder made, they did make Germany more competitive. The other thing which went with it was that he negotiated all these gas deals. He set up Nord Stream 1. He looked forward. He inked the idea of Nord Stream 2. Then along came Angela Merkel, and she dithered about this. She wasn't particularly sure whether she wanted to go ahead with Nord Stream 2. And then she said, well, actually, I do need Nord Stream 2 because I'm now in bed with the Greens. I've got the Greens as my allies. They don't like nuclear power very much. We've had this accident in Japan, in Fukushima. There's been this huge backlash against nuclear power in Germany. So what we're going to do is we're going to close all our nuclear power plants, and we need cheap energy. So let's revive Nord Stream 2. And in 2015, after the crisis in Ukraine had already begun, and after Putin had already been sanctioned, or at least Russia had already been sanctioned by Germany, amongst other countries, Merkel went to Moscow, she had met with Putin, and she talked him into the idea of restarting Nord Stream 2. And by that point, Gazprom, the Russians, were very uncertain, because they were saying, look, if we go ahead with Nord Stream 2, you're going to sanction it. You're going to block it at some point, because the whole trend now is to go for sanctions. And Merkel gave them a cast iron guarantee that would never happen. There would never be sanctions on Nord Stream 2. Whatever sanctions there were, they wouldn't cover Nord Stream 2, and Nord Stream 2 wouldn't be covered by the EU's third energy package. And very, very reluctantly, against their better judgment, the Russians went along with it. It was the Germans that wanted it. The Germans wanted it in order to preserve the competitiveness of their industries. And now that is gone, and it's gone forever. And there's talk about an 8% contraction. Just for the record, the Russian central bank is predicting that the economic contraction in Russia this year will be around 4%. The economics ministry in Russia is saying it'll be around 2%. There's a revised consensual agreement that it will be 2.9%, in other words, 3%. They've basically cut the difference. And there'll be growth next year. Russian economy is going to go back into growth next year, basically irrespective of what happens to sanctions. So we're going to see Germany implode and Russia grow.
What's extraordinary is, who knew we would be sitting here today saying, by golly, we would miss Angela Merkel. I mean, the reality is this never happens if Merkel is there. The war in Ukraine doesn't likely happen. The sanctions war doesn't likely happen. There's no way the U.S. blows up the pipelines while she's there. I did not realize the degree to which she was a restraint, given her EU proclivities and other propensities, on this sort of globalist agenda, this deep state, national security state, whatever you want to call it, agenda in Ukraine. And they're just unleashing everything. And it reminds me of the 1950s, early 1960s American deep state power apparatus in probable collusion with the UK here. We'll see. I mean, the UK, as you noted, Alexander, does have this, imagines itself, fancies itself as still the James Bond of MI6, that kind of, sabotage and secrecy and subversion and the things that they're, in their minds. I always think of Our Man in Havana, even before Taylor of Panama, as to what a lot of this really looks like in reality. And we saw it, of course, with ex-MI6 Christopher Steele, who was the principal propagandist and propagator of the Russiagate hoax. Not a coincidence, all tied into Ukraine and other things too. People forget that was where he was getting his payroll from. But I guess it's clear how the Europeans are going to react, that they're just going to go along and play along and pretend this didn't happen, like a lot of other things. It reminds, like when people said, how in the world could the U.S. really have sabotage of continental Europe? I'd go back and recommend, well, not only our intervention in elections in France and Italy and Greece and some other places in the post-World War II era, and who we went into business with there, certain good family men in places like parts of France and places in Corsica and in, of course, Sicily and Italy, as an alignment to beat the commies, and whatnot. But Operation Gladio, I have a little whole hush-hush episode on Operation Gladio, but, that left behind units often were ex-Nazis and fascists, of course, but ended up causing problems in places like Italy and elsewhere, because when you leave behind a group that has a very distinct ideology, a propensity to violence, and you help train and arm them in secret, that tends to go in directions you may not want it to go in. And so the idea of sabotage of Europe for the broader globalist agenda, deep state agenda, is very much within their wheelhouse. But the scariest thing is all the points that the people in the chat are mentioning in the super chats is that none of this seems to have second level thinking. How will Germany react? How will Europe react? How will Russia react? How will the global South react? How will the American populace react if they ever find this out? I think the only chance of that is if there's a Republican sweep and enough of the right people get into positions of power. Not clear that's going to happen as yet for this Biden administration. But it is, to engage in just open, overt terror against an ally is terrifying. I see how Germany's going to react. They're just going to, I guess, capitulate, go home, and pretend the Ruskies blew up their own pipeline. But how? I mean, it removes the ability for Germany to have an easy exit now. The leverage that Russia had that is now gone over easy access to energy. The access that Germany could turn the spigots back on as a means of solving their own domestic issues is now gone. What's interesting is at least the American reaction is not. It's part of a piece of blaming the Russians, confession through projection. Everything they said about Trump has turned out to be true of the Biden administration, all the way down to having, they accused Trump's family members of being corrupt, particularly Don Jr. Well, of course, that's Hunter Biden, including involving Ukraine. Getting us on the risk of reckless policies is the Biden administration, not Trump. Getting us potentially involved in nuclear war, Biden administration, not Trump. Lack of second-level thinking, second-step thinking is Biden administration, not Trump. But to give people a sense of the scale of it, in the past week, like people had wondered what's going to be the U.S. reaction, the West's reaction to amongst the deep state and the propagandists of this war, the military-industrial complex, the national security apparatus, the Atlanticists, the neoliberals and neocons who are aligned on the issue of Ukraine and Russia. Well, it's denial and delusion is what it is. And so to the Russian mobilization, to the Russian referendums, it's to pretend the referendums didn't exist and don't count. It probably wasn't a coincidence that Putin scheduled this in this same last week of September that we scheduled the Kosovo independent vote many decades ago. It was also last week of September. Probably not a coincidence knowing Putin's modus operandi. The vote was overwhelming. Kherson, about 30% didn't vote. You can probably guess that 30% would have been mostly no votes. But that ship has sailed either way. They have the pretext they need to sweep in and take it over. And then it's Russian proper. And then any attacks on it is an attack on Russia from Russia's legal perspective. And we can't complain about it because we put all this into motion in the post-Cold War, post-Soviet, in the Soviet collapse and breakup era, and we really go all the way back to Woodrow Wilson, the idea of the self-empowerment, self-identification, self-authorization through independence movements and referendums. He was a huge fan of that. And the sort of and that nationalism probably didn't work out so well in certain parts of the world after that, but we used it as including Germany primarily when Yugoslavia broke up to rush in and recognize the breakaway republics, including the most egregious example from a legal perspective being Kosovo. But the international court said that was fine and was not a problem, that there was no. So, Putin's obviously using all of those precedents that we perilously set now against us. And like when people say, well, isn't it illegal what Russia's doing? It's like, actually, it's legal by our own definition, our own terms, and our own precedents. So we would have to condemn and indict ourselves if we're now going to selectively indict Russia over what took place. But I do wonder what they think Russia's reaction is going to be. Aside from the fact, I don't really think they think about second step at all. They just think, oh, we're going to take this out. We're going to show they love to show their power. That's why they secretly want to brag about it. That's why you see people like the ex-Polish guy saying, thank you, USA, after it happens. There's a part of the deep state that wants credit. Say, see how much power we have, see how smart we are, see how savvy we are. But also it's delusional thought. Like the reaction to the referendums didn't happen, don't matter, shams. The reaction to partial mobilization, it's a total disaster in Russia, according to the Western press. Everybody's fleeing the country. They're either trying to flee to Kazakhstan or flee across the border to Finland, or they're bordering so many planes, they're having to shut down the planes, that there's, people shooting each other at draft stops, that, it's in the New York Times writes a piece saying Russia acknowledges this when what they're talking about is something very different that Russia's talking about than what the West is preaching. So much so that you have people like John Brennan and others saying, once again, we're back to the Putin about to collapse, Russia regime about to fail narrative out of the West. And a good number of these people, at least in the Substack, social media, think tank publication world, appear to really believe this. So not only can they convince themselves that they can convince the world that they weren't responsible for the pipeline sabotage, but also that the referendums can be completely ignored and the legal constitutional consequence. What's amazing, doesn't come up in the West. They never mention Yugoslavia. They never mention Kosovo. They never mention the precedents that we helped establish for what Putin is now doing. They don't even mention the comparison. So it's just denial and delusion. And on the military front, all they talk about is the battles up in the northern part of the contested area. They don't focus on Bakhmut or the failed counteroffensive in Kherson. They talk about what took place in part of the Kharkiv and where they're trying to encircle certain towns in the northern part of the Luhansk province. And so they think that the mobilization doesn't matter and it's going to backfire. They think, and it already is, and it's just days. And on the economy side, I think Fortune today is back with what Yale put out a couple of months ago. The Russian economy is just about to collapse once again. So we're back to all of those just repeated lies over and over and over and over. I have people on my own board that will repeat this to me. I'm like, well, what's your source? Oh, it's the Kiev Independent. It's like, the Ghost of Kiev? Kiev Independent? That Kiev Independent? And it's like, yeah. I mean, they found a picture of the Ghost of Kiev. It's a Zelensky in a broken down little a playground plane. I mean, that's a Ghost of Kiev. But it's just one after the other after the other. My fear is that this isn't just propaganda, but that in key parts of the Pentagon, even though people like Colonel McGregor has pointed out, none of this is going to change the battlefield. Russia's going to win. It's only a matter of time. The only question is whether Russia adds Kharkiv and Odessa and any other regions to the equation, using just repeating, the pattern they did here: take it over, occupy it, hold a referendum a couple of months later, call it part of Russia, end of story. And I think that was politically savvy on Russia's part, because no one was ever going to recognize these regions as independent countries of their own type. So you might as well just incorporate it, move on down the road. But the Western press's reaction is denial and delusion, and my greatest fear is they actually believe it. Because if you believe your own lies, that's when real trouble happens.
That's absolutely correct. A number of things about referendums. Well, I can remember that all these breakaway republics were holding them in the Soviet Union in its dying days, and we were cheering it along. We were saying this is a great fact that these referendums were happening. And in fact, as I recall, that is to say, most of the Western countries actually recognized the independence of these republics before the Soviet Union itself had formally given up the ghost. So, don't look at what we do, look at what we say, and that may change from one day to the next as it suits us. But you're absolutely right. We've set these disastrous precedents. We contradicted ourselves completely because, of course, as an American, you know that the United States, one of its presidents, Abraham Lincoln, he set his face against secession. I mean, wasn't he all about, once union has been created, it shouldn't be broken up? And didn't he make great speeches about this? But of course, that's not the policy that we export around the world. And when somebody like Putin comes along and does exactly what we have done in the past, well, that must mean that he's an aggressor, that he's a maniac, a demon, all the bad things that we inevitably and invariably call him. But I just wanted, just before we talk about that a bit more, I wanted to say something, because you're talking about the fact that these people don't understand second order consequences, and I think that's absolutely correct. Now, my memory extends back to the 1960s, and if you lived in Greece in the 1960s, believe me, the US was everywhere. I mean, the US essentially ran Greece, or lots of Greece, in the 1960s. There was even a time when in the apartment building where we lived, the family next door were CIA people from the embassy. So, they were everywhere. But two things. Firstly, they were intelligent people. And secondly, there was never any doubt at all that the politicians in Washington were in control and knew what they were doing. And we're talking about people like, JFK, LBJ, whatever you may think of him. They were people who had an understanding of things. And if you go back a little further, American policy in Europe in the 1950s and 1940s was to build Europe up. It was the United States that made it possible for Germany to recover and to rebuild. It was the United States in Little Greece, which I remember, that set the scene for a growth rate that we were having in the 50s and 60s, which was 7% per annum. The US in those days wasn't looking to immiserate its allies. It was looking to strengthen its allies, to make them prosperous, to make them rich, to build up an economic system, which, by the way, was not a globalist system in those days. It was very much still a system where there was, trade was controlled to a great extent, much more so than today. It was the Bretton Woods system with fixed exchange rates, all connected to the dollar. So it's very different from today. But the point was that the United States wanted to integrate all of these countries into a system of world trade which would be mutually beneficial for them and for the United States itself, because there was a very clear understanding that if the United States was going to maintain this extraordinary level of prosperity that it had achieved by the 1950s and the 1960s, it would need strong economies, friendly economies to trade with, and that in the 1950s and 60s meant the economies of countries like Europe and, of course, Japan and South Korea and other places. So what we see today, if there really are actually out there, blowing up pipelines in order to create problems for their European allies, that the wheel has come completely full circle. We're now in a policy where before, whatever deep state you had in those days, where before you had a policy of economic building and construction, a positive policy that won over people like me, made people like me very favorably disposed to the United States. What you now have, it seems to me, is a policy of nihilism, and sooner or later people will understand it, and it will make people in the future resent the United States. So, I cannot understand how the leadership class in America could have fallen into this folly. They're now so twisted and so caught up in their plots and schemes and plans and conspiracies and whatever that they've completely lost track of where US interests actually lie. I wanted to make that point as somebody, as I said, who remembers. It's just on the tip of my memory because I was a child, but everybody was talking about it. Wherever you went, you saw Americans. Everybody talked about the Americans and what the Americans were doing, and the mood, the sentiment was overwhelmingly positive. Now, on the situation with the war, you're absolutely right, Robert. People are completely delusional about this. Of course, it's probably true that they're all getting their information from a very, very limited resource base. Now, every day I and Alex, we plow through all of these reports. There's very good reporters on the front lines. And of course, the thing to say about this is that in reality, this September, what has happened this September in this war has not been Ukraine winning. It is Ukraine still losing. September was the point where their military had swollen to its biggest ever possible size. They got all the weapons that the United States and the Europeans could throw at them. This was their moment. If they were ever going to succeed in turning this thing round, this September was going to be the month when they were going to do it. And they failed. They weren't able to break through in Kherson region. They weren't able to break through in the major places in Donbass. The place where they broke through, where in Kharkiv region, was a region which, for all kinds of reasons, the Russians had already largely pulled out from. So now they're trying to make attacks in northern Donbass, and the fact is that even though the Russians are actually outnumbered in these areas, they're finding it very difficult to make any progress at all. Now, in a few weeks, we're going to get the autumn rains. Offensives are going to come to a stop. They've lost large numbers of men over the course of the fighting over the last few weeks. Ukraine has. more importantly, they've lost lots of the machinery, the weapons, the tanks, all those things that the West has given them, and there's no replacements. And then when the ground hardens and the temperatures fall and the tanks can start moving again, they're going to be faced with a Russian military on a far bigger scale than what they've been up against until this moment. So, in fact, this has not been a good month for Ukraine, at least not in my perception. It's been a month of failure, of actual military, overall military failure. Now, on the point about the fact that it's easier for the Russians just to incorporate regions into Russia than to try and pretend that they're independent, that is obviously right. And again, if you look at the publications of their allies or their friends, let's call them friends rather than allies, China, India, and all the rest, it's much easier for the Chinese and the Indians to continue to support Russia if it's incorporating these territories than to support Russia if Russia is supporting secessionists. Because Chinese, Indians do not like secession, but they're very nationalistic and they understand very well that if you're bringing people into the motherland again and you're protecting your own people, that's something that the Chinese and the Indians can do. These referendums are going to simplify, are going to make Russian diplomatic moves from now on easier than they had been previously. Just my thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, no, I mean, all of it is striking to me because it's anticipating. I mean, like when Putin had to make a speech saying people in the West talking about using nuclear weapons against Russia should realize the wind blows the other way too. And then that was converted into Putin threatens West with nuclear war instead of him reacting to this kind of provocative talk in the West about it. It just shows the mindset has lost the script and any sense of self-restraint. Yeah, I mean, because basically what you see is there has, since the post-World War II era, been a mindset in parts of the American deep state that has not looked at allies, but looked at a dominant subordinate relationship. But at least it tended not to be purely or consistently or always an abusive relationship. I mean, there are aspects. I mean, we tried to kill Mitterrand however many times. I mean, de Gaulle multiple times in France. Our complicity was all over the place there with Alan Dulles and others. So there was Operation Gladio and other things like that. But, you know, not to the scale that we would blow up civilian infrastructure just to have leverage over Russia in a conflict that we're not even directly involved in. That's a kind of a different animal, of a different breed. And it's become more of just a pure abuser-abused relationship. When I was representing victims of domestic violence, I remember a shrink explaining to me, in an abused or abuser relationship, there's never equality. There is, you are either the abuser or you are the abused. And if you don't want to be the abused, become the abuser. And that's your only alternative in that relationship dynamic. And that's kind of what's happening here. And clearly nobody in Europe has any pushback at all. I mean, even the celebrated election in parts of the western right of Meloni in Italy, she was eager to say she's very pro-NATO and very pro the war in Ukraine. She was eager to, now maybe that's to buy time and buy political space to try to do what she wants to do on immigration and domestic policy, given she's got to get some EU permission effectively for a range of things given Italy's financial issues. But that relates to another place where we just right now don't care or don't appear to care about the rest of the world. While there's a fair dispute and debate about whether or not interest rate rises by central banks necessarily make their currency stronger, there are several good analysts out there that there's actually not quite the correlation people think there is, and the real problem of the dollar's dominance in its negative adverse impact around the globe is that there's too much dollar-denominated debt and too much dollar dominance in currency transactions, and that's almost an incurable problem with inadequate dollar supply for a range of reasons. Putting that aside, it is at least popularly believed in many financial circles that the Fed increasing interest rates consistently, and it's clear that's going to keep marching on. They believe their credibility depends upon them continuing on the explicit and express path of rising interest rates, and have said they don't believe a soft landing will happen, and they want to see unemployment go way up. And until they see unemployment go way up in America, they're going to keep hiking. Well, the perception is that makes the dollar more dominant, and it leads to a currency war like what we're seeing around the globe. Japan, extraordinary intervention to try to salvage its currency. Even China had to step in when it got up over 7 yuan to the dollar and impose some restraints there. And then, of course, right now, most notoriously, is what is happening, though I think it's mostly self-inflicted. There's at least some blame in British financial circles on the Fed, hiking interest rates constantly. What is happening to the pound? I mean, there's actual talk. Even Larry Summers was out saying, believes that the pound will be worth less than the dollar within the year. I mean, I remember it was like $1.60, $1.70 every time I went to the UK. I mean, it was pricey. I mean, sterling. The word itself, the language itself meant, prime. Well regarded, strong. You now look. I mean, the pound drops by 3-4%. There's a pension crisis. There's a financial liquidity crisis. The Bank of England has to reverse course from raising interest rates and quantitative tightening to quantitative easing, going in and buying bonds to keep them from collapsing. I mean, this is the prime finance for people that don't always appreciate it. London is still the financial center of the world, largely. I mean, it is the center, at least of the Western world. To see this happen in the UK, I mean, the last time it happened was when George Soros was lining his pockets, betting against the pound. So you wonder if he's still involved. But that's probably another story for another day, old Georgie. I'm sure he's making money either which way the wind blows. But sometimes he helps the wind blow in certain ways. But Tuss, she comes in, and her reaction is to let's do more stimulation. I mean, I get the idea of tax cuts, but combining where and how you're going to finance it with borrowings, basically you're going to stimulate an inflationary economy. That doesn't seem to be all that sensible. But what exactly is happening there in Britain?
This is exactly what you said. I mean, this is exactly what's happened. People have over-focused on the tax cuts. There's been too much attention given to the tax cuts. Tax cuts are actually reasonably minor, and there are some people who feel that overall they're probably beneficial to the economy if they were run properly. The problem is not the tax cuts. The problem is that the government is overspending. They're adding to the spending on a massive way. In fact, it's very like, in some ways, what the Biden administration was doing in its first year. We have had a dash for growth. We cut taxes, we increase spending, we try and increase liquidity across the system. We try to support the housing market. We've had many examples, by the way, of what's called the dash for growth policy in Britain since the 50s. But this has been done in a most extreme and eccentric way. So we have very high inflation in Britain, higher than in the United States. It's almost certainly well into double figures if you look at it properly. That inflation is undermining living standards. So you take that inflationary fire and you pour petrol on it, which is what you're doing with this, huge rush of extra spending on all kinds of things, like trying to control the household bills that people pay for their energy, things of this kind. I mean, so you do that, and then you say, well, inflation isn't going to take off. Nobody, of course, believes you. And then as you're increasing all that spending, you add even that tweak more by cutting taxes. So, of course, people are saying, this is irrational. This doesn't make any kind of sense. We're not going to get a dash for growth. We've already been there with the Biden administration. We saw it. We saw what happened there. We're in an even worse position than they're in. I mean, at least they got a reserve currency to, fall back on. And inflation when they started wasn't actually very high, but now it's very high, and we don't even have a reserve currency in the way that the dollar is a reserve currency. So of course there's an absolute meltdown. There is a complete nervous collapse across the financial system here. And the pound is important. The fall in sterling is important. And if sterling falls below parity, that will be a profound psychological shock for people in Britain, especially, by the way, if I may add, for people who vote Conservative. So, I mean, that will deepen the sense of crisis. But if you really want to know what was the actual epicenter of the turmoil, it was the government bond market, the gilts market, in other words. Because, of course, people looked at all of this and they said, the government wants us to lend them, hundreds and hundreds of billions of pounds. And, they've given no plan of how they're going to pay this all back. They've given no structure for trying to restrain all this spending going forward. So, of course, what do? We pull out of gilts, and that's exactly what happened. So the Bank of England had to reverse its policy and resume QE, which, of course, it insisted and promised us it would never do. Now, Britain has its eccentricities. We have a very eccentric government. We have a Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, who is, by the way, somebody I know. I have to say that because people should be aware of the fact that I actually know Kwasi. But we have our Chancellor. We have who is as I said, very academic-minded person, very clever, but clever in my opinion in the way that academics are clever. Not somebody, I think, who has that feel for the pulse of commercial life, which, if you're really going to run an economy, is what you really need. But all right, we have our eccentricities and our peculiarities, but I'm going to say something. Britain is the canary in the coal mine. What has happened here in Britain over the last few days signals what is coming. Basically, the reason it happened was because the government, the British government, doesn't understand how bad the situation in the economy really is, how bad the situation in society really is. They thought they were in a much stronger position than they actually were in, and they thought they could therefore take risks with the economy, which of course they can't. And that delusion exists everywhere, at least in the West. It's a delusion that's shared still amongst the European economies. People in Germany still think it. I'm afraid there are even some people in the United States who are, I think, unduly complacent about how bad the situation is.
Yeah, I mean, it's extraordinary. Now, what do you think about? I've always thought that the British royalty as an institution was kind of past its expiration date, but for the Queen, that her personal popularity, magnanimous personality after Princess Di's death in particular, who I thought helped resurrect aspects of the institution. But, whenever I've been over in the UK, you do have this sort of strong respect still for the royal institutions. How much do you think it can last under a guy like Charles, particularly if he weaponizes it for climate change and things like that? I thought the Queen hid a lot of the questionable conduct of the royal family over time because of her personal likability and individual charm. Is it a sustainable institution with someone like Charles at the helm?
Well, straightforwardly, I don't think so. Now, the thing to understand about the Queen is that, of course, she became Queen in 1952. This is a completely different world from the world of today. I mean, Joseph Stalin was still running things in Moscow in 1952. That tells you how long she was Queen. And, of course, when she was Queen, Britain was an industrial power. It was the third biggest economy in the world. People tend to forget that. We had a major industrial base, and we still had a far-flung empire. We'd lost India a few years, 4 years before, but we had all the other parts of the empire. They were still, part of the great imperial system that had been built up, before. So the Queen becomes Queen, taking over all of that. And she was a charming, young person, brought up, schooled in the concept of service, of loyalty to Britain. She'd played a role in a minor way in the Second World War. She'd actually enlisted in things. Anyway, so she embodied all of those things. And she was obviously there as the Queen. Now, Britain changed and it contracted. It ceased to be an empire. It lost its industrial base. British society changed completely. It became much more, I would say, well, I'm going to use the word vulgar. It became much more vulgar. You only have to look at British tabloids to see how vulgar Britain has become. And the point to understand is, throughout all of that change, one person remained the same, and that was the Queen. She was at the end essentially the same person that she had been in 1952, and that gave the British a tremendous sense of reassurance and stability. She was the rock upon which everything else spun. So, everything changed. There she was, Elizabeth R. And, we all looked up to her. Many of us who are not particularly monarchically minded. And we had this enormous respect. And she connected us to our past and helped us to manage this transition to a very chaotic present and a very uncertain future. And now she's gone. And that rock has gone. And we look at her successor, Charles, and, we find a rather eccentric figure, not perhaps with the self-discipline that his mother had. And then we look at the younger royals who will come after Charles, and he won't be king for very long because he's already well into his 70s. But we look at the other royals, and we see, instead of that sense of service that Elizabeth had, we see instead a sense of entitlement. And people are not going to like it. So I don't think it will survive. That's my own personal belief.
I'm always reminded of when the MI6 accidentally confused the Queen with a ship called the Queen in communicating to U.S. intelligence to convince the Shah of Iran during the planned coup in the 1950s that the Queen, who the Shah looked up to and had special particular deference and respect towards, was convinced by U.S. intelligence that the Queen herself wanted him to stay in Iran, not leave, so they could help stage the coup. And of course, who knows what would have happened? It turned out it wasn't the Queen. The MI6 accidentally confused that with a ship somehow in how they relayed the message. But the Brits were and the Americans were very interested in oil dominance in Iran, and all the CIA Kermit Roosevelt types had that sort of Lawrence of Arabia vision of who they were going to be. It's why they were Arabists, not so much pro-Israel. They were more Arabist, and that's still strong within the CIA and State Department. Probably the biggest difference between neoliberals and neoconservatives is that approach on aspects of Israel and Iran. And now we've seen a very different Iran, and I can see two things at the same time being true. I can say the American populist perspective or inclination with something like Iran is twofold. We don't go abroad searching for monsters to destroy, so not interested in intervention, invasion, or the rest. But that doesn't preclude many in America from seeing Iran as a monster. The perspective, there's a good number of Iranians that I know in LA, and most Iranian Americans, Patrick Bet David, others that have some social media influence, very anti this Iranian government. People can take that for what it is. And they could see the possibility of deep state involvement with Iran. There's some articles out today about whether the CIA screwed up its efforts to undermine Iran and some things like, basically more CIA screw-ups, no surprise there. But it's one of those situations, kind of like when we saw the rumors of a coup in China, that getting honest information is difficult because the Iranian regime is not exactly the most open press regime in the world. And so, and the deep state is more than capable of staging color revolutions throughout the Arab world like anywhere else. So it's figuring out how much of this is organic, how much of this is authentic, how much of this is even consequential. Sometimes I get pushback where people are like, why are Americans anti-Iran, aside from the issue of Israel? There's that wing of the American right that's very aligned with Israel, that's anti-Iran because Israel sees it as Iran is a major threat to their security and well-being. Take that for whatever you want to. It's because this regime introduced itself by holding Americans hostage. So, that's the first part of the American knowledge of this regime. The second is, when they see Death to America chants at every weekend parade. So there's within the American political right, there's not going to be a lot of sympathy for Iran. There's probably less sympathy for Iran than almost any other regime not named China in the American political right. Take that, but that doesn't mean people are for interventions, invasions, wars. The whole foundational principle of American populist foreign policy was the great speech that said, we do not go abroad searching for monsters to destroy. Doesn't mean we don't see something as a monster, but sometimes when people see American right hostility to Iran, they interpret that to mean, sure, go in and let's try another Afghanistan, another Iraq, another Libya, another Syria. That's not the case, at least within the populist right. Some of the neocon right would love to overthrow Iran, regime change in Iran. But how much of what you've seen is real and not real in Iran? How much of it is a threat of major revolt and repression? How much of it is kind of not that big a deal and being exaggerated? What's your read on it, given the difficulty of source accuracy here in the States?
Right. Well, can I say, first of all, there's a lot of Iranians in Britain, and I have a lot of Iranian acquaintances. The first thing I'm going to say is that there is a lot of dissatisfaction with the regime in Iran. There's an awful lot of dissatisfaction with the regime amongst Iranians. This is not something that is invented. There's a widespread feeling that Iran is underperforming, that it's a developed country, it's an educated country. It could do an awful lot better if it was better run, and the way that the regime operates keeps it back, holds it back in many ways. And there's intense frustration, not just amongst women, but amongst a lot of Iranians about the various extreme social controls that exist in Iran, which we must always understand. Like always, we know when controls are imposed. You see this in the United States in a completely different way, when you have people looking out all the time for misbehavior. It's also a way of political control, and that does cause resentments. Now, having said that, the one thing I have always and invariably found is that the one thing that makes Iranians come together and say, well, we can't push things too far, is a sense that whatever is going on in their country, when there's protests, that the United States, the CIA, whatever it is, the outside adversary, if you like, is out there controlling it or manipulating it. I think if people in the United States want to see change happen in Iran, the simplest and most effective thing they could do was to leave it alone. I think the Iranians themselves would do it. If there was no sense in Iran or amongst Iranians that, if we come out and protest, somebody, this big, powerful country, far away, which is adversarial to us, will come in and reorder things and take us back to where we were in the 1970s, which most Iranians absolutely do not want. And they have very vivid memories of the time, when the Shah was there. So if that possibility is taken away, if that threat does not exist, then you would probably see, in fact, I am sure you would see, change in Iran happen much more quickly. Now, I say that, I don't pretend to be an Iranian expert.